My name is Fiona Greenland. I'm a part of the ASA Culture section. It's been a great privilege to work with this committee, continuing the ASA Culture section series in Culture and Contemporary Life. The Culture and Contemporary Life series is here to ground cutting-edge cultural sociological work in some of the most urgent issues of the day. And I'm really grateful to Murray Phillips for pulling together a session that brings together questions on religion, theodicy, and the powers of social life. So Murray is currently a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota, and she's a specialist in religion, culture, politics, and violence. And she brings to her work a transnational focus on the United States and the Middle East. Murray, before I turn it over to you for introductions, I'd like to welcome our audience members. We'll be encouraging questions and comments at the end of this session. Please take advantage of the chat panel. There's a Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I do want to remind everybody to turn microphones off so just that we have the clearest audio possible. Thanks again, everybody. Murray, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you everyone for coming to today's installment. So as part of the Culture and Contemporary Life series, today we're talking about theodicy and the problem of meaning. The session will be recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube page. And I'm the moderator for today. And as Fiona said, I'm a PhD candidate in sociology, and my work looks at meaning making at the intersection of religion and human rights. So today's discussion grapples with the complexity of attributing meaning to violence and suffering. The inevitability of death, the inescapability of suffering, and the relentless persistence of violence prompts people to ask, what is the meaning of suffering? And one way to grapple with this question is through theodicy, which revolves around the problem of how people reconcile their belief in a God with the existence of evil. And the idea is that if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, then why does evil exist? While the problem of theodicy is commonly framed by religion, theorists like Max Weber and Peter Berger have also talked about a secular theodicy, which is any attempt at all to explain or bestow meaning upon experiences of suffering. So while some people can and do attribute suffering with meaning, others altogether reject it, arguing that suffering is meaningless, that it has no sacred origin or purpose, and that any attempt to explain it results in legitimating it. So these are some of the questions that our panelists are going to grapple with today. And our panelists today are Zeina Al-Azmeh, who's a research fellow and a lecturer at the University of Cambridge. Her work explores the cultural sociologies of knowledge production and the impact of meaning construction on political subjectivities in exile. She's currently working on a project that examines exile, political subjectivity in the aftermath of the Syrian, Egyptian, and Tunisian revolutions. Biko Mandela Gray is an assistant professor of religion at Syracuse University, where he teaches and writes about the relationship between Blackness, religion, ethics, and embodiment. His recent work, Black Lives Matter, is a philosophical eulogy for Ayanna Stanley Jones, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, and Sandra Bland. Christina Simcoe is an associate professor of sociology at Williams College, where she researches the impact of violent pasts on identity and narrative. She's currently working on a project that examines terrorism memorials and museums as windows into contemporary trauma culture in the United States. So I've asked the panelists today to prepare for a set of questions, and then we're going to turn to Q&A in the end. So please write your questions in the chat, and please make sure that they're that everyone can see them. So the first round of questions, we're concerned with the big picture of meaning and theodicy. So Christina, we'll start with you. What insights does sociology broadly and cultural sociology specifically offer about theodicy and the problem of meaning? I think you're muted. I'll work on that now.
Christina, it should work now. I was overzealous in my host protection functions there.
Nope, Fiona, completely understand
Back on
that. That's
track.
the right call.
Thanks.
I couldn't unmute myself. I kept getting that error message. So thank you so much, Marie and Fiona, for organizing this, and everyone for being here. I know that it is a fleeting time, so I'll just jump right in. Marie, the way you asked the question is interesting because so often especially the pre-tenure phase of my career, I had to think about it in the opposite way, right? So what does Theodicy and the problem of meaning offer cultural sociology? And so it's a pleasure to sort of step back and think about the question framed in the opposite way. And so for me, the profundity of the Theodicy concept, at least as I initially encountered it in Weber and then in Berger, is that it is this place where sociology touches on theology and philosophy and does something that theology and philosophy don't necessarily do, or at least aren't as equipped to do as well as I think sociology can be equipped to do it, which is that they these ideas allow us to touch on ideas of lay or popular theodicy, right? So connecting, there's this really profound line in the philosopher Susan Neiman's book. I think it's in the preface to her book, Evil in Modern Thought. And she writes about how the problems that philosophers grapple with in these treatises that feel obscure to most people are actually the same problems that motivate bright 17-year-olds to worry and wonder about the meaning of their lives. And I think sociology and allied social sciences offer us windows onto the popular or lay, if you want to use the more sort of religious clerical language, ways that people grapple with questions that seem like strictly highfalutin theological or philosophical questions, but actually are matters that we all have to encounter because we're all mortal beings. We will all suffer in one respect or another. We will all both experience grief and encounter the grief of others. And so I'll just stick with that to kick us off.
Thank you, Christina. Zaina, in your own work, you write about the dichotomy between who is entitled to meaning and whose lives are devoid of meaning. So can you elaborate on this dichotomy and what does it mean for the decolonization of the study of meaning?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And thank you, Marie and Fiona, for organizing this, and the audience for attending. So in this work, I examine the narratives of discourse and discourses of Syrian artists, writers, and public intellectuals in exile, as they grapple with and make meaning around suffering, the suffering that was generated specifically by the revolution turned war in Syria since 2011. And one of the themes that emerged from my interviews with about 30 such intellectuals and from my analysis of their work in the period between 2011 and 2019 was a tension around the question of meaning, or the meaning of meaning, particularly as it relates to suffering. More specifically, meaning comes up often in interviews in 4 distinct but interconnected ways. The first and most obvious is linguistic, meaning as signification. For example, what is meant by freedom or dignity or justice as demands that were being chanted on the streets in 2011. The second is existential meaning, that is, the perceived meaning of one's life, one's labor, and the evident need for people to give their life and labor such meaning, or the inverse needs to derive meaning from one's life, action, and labor. The third was a sense of meaning where the word came up as significance, as meaning as significance. For example, the meaning or meaninglessness of someone's life or someone's suffering. So the importance, the perceived significance by others, the importance that is attributed by others to this life or death or suffering and more. And finally, the fourth meaning that came across is meaning as essence. For example, they would talk about the meaning or meanings of the revolution. In all of this, the meta-analysis of meaning, so to speak, in Syrian intellectual discourses reveals a shift over time from a phase where meaning is central in the early days of the revolution, often described by them as kind of a period of intensification of meaning, or the revolution being described as a quest for meaning, or even a revolution of meaning. And gradually towards the loss of meaning. So from an intensification and centrality of meaning to the loss of meaning towards the later years of the revolution turned war, particularly after the violent turn of the revolution and the atrocities, and particularly as atrocities seemed to participants to be neglected or disregarded by the international community. So in other words, I observe a shift from a state where the revolutionary movement was presented as a quest for existential and political meaning and a reclaiming of linguistic meaning through freedom of expression in the first months of the peaceful protest, gradually to a questioning of meaning and sometimes a loss of meaning, particularly as the revolution turned into a civil war. So this loss of meaning manifests itself not only in rejection of the idea of meaning, eventually like towards the end, as kind of privileged philosophizing at the expense of people's lives and freedoms, but also sometimes as an anger towards the world for having denied, and this is a word that the participants sometimes use, denied Syrians of their right to meaning by reducing their plight to a geopolitical or sometimes environmental explanations, or by reducing their plight or attributing it to the agenda of the war on terror. And they perceived that kind of as both a stealing of the meanings that they intended, that they felt made sense to them about what was happening, but also as a denial of the meaning of their lives and their deaths and their suffering. And there was a sense for these research participants that even when they took extraordinary risks to enact their political agency, to fight for a better, fairer, more meaningful life or future, maybe for their children or future generations, Syrians were still ultimately reduced to bare life. Their movement was stripped of its meaning and their lives treated as worthless or meaningless. And such a view of the collective self in the wake of revolution reminds us of what Ron Eierman refers to as a cognitive praxis of a social movement. And in this cognitive praxis, these participants viewed Syrians as being denied of meaning in all four senses of the word described earlier, which brings forth the idea that people have a right to meaning, a concept that offers a framework for understanding global inequality. So it is a framework that rests on a perceived dichotomy between those entitled to meaning and those whose lives are accepted and treated as devoid of meaning, or to whom meaning is actively denied, whether in terms of taking seriously the meanings they make about the struggle they are engaged with, or the meanings that they attribute to their movement, or the meaningfulness of their lives and death, or their right to existentially meaningful lives outside of oppression and dictatorship. As for the second part of your question of what does it mean for the decolonization of the study of meaning? Examining the engagement of exiled intellectuals with the Syrian revolution has allowed me to unsettle what Jeffrey Alexander describes as, quote unquote, the central paradox of cultural trauma theory. And in this paradox, he claims that while, I quote, it has been the non-Western regions of the world and the most defenseless amongst them that have been subjected to some of the most traumatic injuries, it has been Western societies that have recently provided the most dramatic apologias for traumatic episodes in their national histories, end of quote. So in a way, Alexander describes a failure, and he uses that word, or an inability, again his word, by carrier groups within these traumatized collectivities in the global South to carry through a trauma process, which results in mass atrocities that have, he says, so rarely branded themselves on the consciousness of the wider population. So by using this non-Western case study, my work highlights that there is no failure in delivering the message. In fact, there's fervent work being done to make meaning out of the suffering, to deliver some kind of message, to imprint the trauma onto collective consciousness, not just within the collectivity that has suffered the suffering, but also beyond it, arguably internationally. There is a lot of fervent effort towards that, but the problem is that it is not always being received in the way that they desire it to be received and understood. So it highlights, basically what I'm trying to do is highlight the specificity and some misunderstandings about cultural trauma in non-Western contexts. And in a sense, challenge the universalizing claims of what we can see as hegemonic trauma theory. So my aim is to research a front, to open a research front towards a decolonial cultural trauma theory that is showing how examining cases beyond Europe and the US might qualify certain theoretical assumptions about cultural trauma processes and how meanings are made and contested, and how collective identities are changed or marked in the aftermath of tragedy and collective suffering.
Thank you, Zaina. Biko, is suffering meaningless, and how is theodicy leveraged to justify violence?
So I'm happy to be here. I would also want to open by saying I'm not a sociologist. I'm a philosopher of religion by training. So that means that some of the things that you all are understanding is sort of abstract. This is my terrain. And so one of the things that I do want to say up front, though, is suffering meaningless? No, it's not. But the question for me actually is, what kind of meanings get attributed to which kinds of suffering? Right. So in the philosophical tradition, we have what we often discuss as, when we're thinking about this question of theodicy or this issue of theodicy, we're often thinking about it in relation to usually two kinds of what we call evil. Natural evil, which is tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, the things that have been going down in the United States, for example, in the Midwest, so on and so forth. That's natural evil. These are things we cannot control. Insurance companies call them acts of God. Right. Those kinds of things have a meaning inherent to them that are sort of external to human control. The other kind of evil is moral evil. And this notion of evil is the kind of evil that human beings enact upon one another. Why am I bringing this up? Because the question of moral evil is the question out of which the Theodician claims come. Even though we don't think about them in theological terms as much anymore, and I personally think that's a good thing, one of the things that I will say, just to sort of keep this brief, is that the question usually, or the meaning of suffering usually has little to do with the value of the life of the sufferer. And what I mean by that is to use a very basic example. Someone is struggling, a parent is struggling with a child who is suffering in childbirth or early in their life, or whatever the case may be. You will hear conversations like, this is all happening for a reason, or God has a plan, or it will all work out in the end, or things could and would get better. And all of these moves, essentially philosophically, at a philosophical level, they are logic games that are essentially trying to produce meaning out of the suffering, but not for the sufferer, if that makes sense. Produce meaning out of the suffering, but not for the sufferer. And so the question that I'm ultimately interested in is to respond to the question, is suffering meaningless? No, it rarely is. But the question for me is, who benefits from the meaning of suffering that gets carried out? Right? And does theodicy serve to justify that kind of violence? Absolutely. That is theodicy's entire, at least at the philosophical level, that is theodicy's entire enterprise. It is to play a logic game with the sort of inconvenience of the idea of a good God and suffering and evil in the world. The only thing that I will add here that Christina sort of gestured toward, that I come at through people like Lewis Gordon as well, and Anthony Penn and some other Black Africana philosophers, is that theodicy actually gets secularized in the modern period. And so instead of it being God who is justifying, instead of God being the object or the thing that needs to be justified in the face of profound and undeserved human suffering and evil, it ends up being society. And not simply Peter Berger's sacred canopy, right? But also nation states, geopolitical nation states, Euro geopolitical nation states, European geopolitical nation states that must maintain their goodness at the expense of anybody else's suffering at all costs. This is something we see in a Hegelian theodicy, where the West, exemplified in Germany, is constantly understanding itself to get better. So to answer the questions very briefly and recap, suffering is meaningful, and theodicy is always deployed to justify the suffering that comes.
So turning to some of your empirical work, how do you think about meaning and theodicy in your respective contexts of the Syrian conflict, anti-Black violence, and terrorism museums post 9/11? And most importantly is what is at stake? We'll start with Zaina and then Biko and Christina.
So in my work, the question of theodicy emerged in its secular forms. My empirical findings certainly confirm the idea that we need to give meaning. Religion and conversation with or questions about God are pervasive ways in which giving meaning to suffering is sought, both in Syrian context and elsewhere. And probably the more the suffering, the more the need to seek solace and meaning in religion and spirituality in God. And this partially, I think, explains the relative success of Islamist jihadists in recruiting young traumatized fighters, particularly in the most disadvantaged parts of the Syrian geography. But even in the secularist context of artists and intellectuals that I study, we see a fervent quest for meaning in contexts of crisis and disaster, to make sense of suffering through language, to poeticize pain through art, to ritualize it, to articulate it in order to capture it and contain it. And suffering that is without meaning does seem unbearable to most, and our quest for meaning, even when rooted in pain and injustice, produces fascinating cultural phenomena because the intensification of meaning that suffering seems to arouse often results among the artistically, literarily, or intellectually inclined in an outpouring of words, art, ideas, interventions of all kinds that seek to not only represent sometimes seemingly unrepresentable experiences as they were described by one of my participants, but to frame them into tolerability. And this isn't new, of course. We saw it happening time and again in the aftermath of war, revolutions, and genocides throughout history and across the globe. But what I also found in the fieldwork was that in cases of prolonged suffering, we begin to see a kind of meaning fatigue, if you will, which sometimes leads to a war on the idea of meaning and eventually a loss of meaning. So meaning and the quest for meaning in the Syrian case was sometimes seen as a privilege and a sophism, a complicit in the killing and the suffering. In the case study, in the empirical work, this happened in three distinct but interconnected ways. There was a questioning of the act of meaning making, particularly in exile, where people felt, artists and writers felt that what for? When they were in the safety of exile, they lost any motivation or any sense of, the meaning of creating meaning. They lost the motivation to the question that kept occurring, what for, particularly in the first period, like the first few months after arriving into safety. There was also an ontological questioning of existential and metaphysical meaning, and there was a sense of being denied of meaning that I spoke about earlier. So if we accept the argument that what mobilized Syrians was a demand for meaning, this is the argument that some of the participants actually made, it became clear from the regime's response to the movement that Syrians were now confronting a choice between survival and meaning, an ultimatum between their life, or sorry, if you want to invoke Agamben, and a life of possibilities, potentialities. With aspirations for and deliberations on meaning being typically the turf of intellectual elites, while those being killed predominantly being from marginalized classes, the idea of the struggle for meaning generated a sense of guilt. So the quest for meaning became a symbolic culprit in the killing, and some intellectuals began to reject it. One interviewee told me, I quote, "For the past 7 years, we have been deliberating about ideas of meaning, exile, war, and the rest of it, while people are just being massacred. There is no rationality. There is no room for meaning." End of quote. In some cases, the questioning of the act of meaning making was also connected to the experience of exile, as I mentioned. So once stricken with safety, the sense of purpose that intellectual labor offered back home became inaccessible. One of the study participants, for example, described an inability to work after fleeing Syria. I quote, he said, "I am unable to bring myself to write here. Even if I wanted to, writing has lost its meaning. There is no meaning anymore. All of our dreams about Syria, everything we thought possible and believed in, everything we did to push things forward for a better future is lost." End of quote. So in summary, meaning and the construction of meaning, including around questions of theodicy or sociodicy, if you want, remains central to the work of Syrian intellectuals in the aftermath of the revolution turned war. But prolonged trauma and suffering resulted in a questioning or even a loss of meaning that has taken many shapes. This loss of meaning was intensified when their sacrifices and screams for justice, seemed to be reaching their ears globally, but often this despair was resisted after a while. And when that happened, it was often transformed into kind of a hopeless perseverance that draws not on a faith in the possibility of change, but on an ethics or even perhaps an aesthetic of resigned resistance, a hopeless commitment to struggle, not for its potential to enact change, but that has in the context of Syria almost become despaired of, but as a categorical, at least temporarily, sorry, I have to add, but as a categorical imperative, as a way of being that we choose, or that often chooses us, as they would come.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to hear the sort of comparative context, because what was coming to mind for me in relation to this, I just wrote a book called Black Lives Matter, which was in my bio, and so I'll try to be brief with this response. So there are two quotes that come to mind, and then one conceptual thing that I'll sort of do to try to frame my comments. Two quotes that come to mind. The first one that is sort of pervasive in the US context, not all cops are bad. This is the first one. Not all police are bad. There are some bad apples. In the wake of a death, of a shooting, of an anti-Black police shooting, you often hear the claim, not all cops are bad. And so the goal is ultimately to try and produce in that and actually that statement itself is a Theodician statement, an attempt to justify the goodness of the state in the face of what Black folks anyway would understand as unjust violence and undue suffering placed upon or the once lives of Black folk. First kind of theodicy as it relates to questions of anti-Blackness, a sort of sociocultural but also sociopolitical theodicy encapsulated in not all cops are bad. Second thing that I think about in relation to questions of anti-Blackness and theodicy, in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020, when Derek Chauvin was convicted, the then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, made a claim that George Floyd, quote, sacrificed his life for justice. This particular claim that comes out is a socio-political theodicy. Why do I say this? Because it justifies George Floyd's death retrospectively as a good thing in order for the country to gain justice and progress. So I've given you two so far, right? The first, not all cops are bad. Any claims about defunding or abolishing the police are always met with Theodician claims about reform. We need to reform the police, not get rid of them, because that is how theodicy works. It justifies the goodness of the state in the face of anti-Black or in the face of Black suffering. Third thing that comes to mind, and this is where I will end. The Afro-pessimists make a claim ultimately that I ride with, but also don't ride with, and this is getting to Zaina's work just a little bit, is that it turns out that at least as the Afro-pessimists are thinking through this, or as I'm thinking with them, I'm riffing off of them, that the question of meaning is actually an immaterial question for Black life, insofar as our suffering or the meanings we attribute to our suffering cannot register to the larger political or sociocultural consciousness. So when I think about these questions of meaning and questions of theodicy and questions of anti-Blackness, the claim that Black Lives Matter, for example, or the claim that, any claim about Black justice actually is immaterial to what happens in the larger dominant context. And so the question of meaning is ultimately a question of how do we grapple not with the meaning we make for ourselves in the wake of our suffering, but how do we grapple with, I love that idea of a sort of perpetual hopeless resistance. How do we grapple with the frustrations, the angers, the pushbacks, the violence of the justification of our suffering by large multinational geopolitical nation states? So that's how I would respond to this question of how this shows up in my work. My idea is that the entire the entire geopolitical edifice of the West is built upon what I call an anti-Black theodicy. And I've tried to articulate that within the context of my comments.
I want to question Biko's claim that you're not a sociologist, but I'll leave that for later. I'll leave that for offline because I think there's actually a lot of really extraordinary sociology going on in your comments. I mean, I will try to distill, I think, some of what has been said insofar as it overlaps with my own work. I think what is at stake. All of us are concerned in some form or fashion with violence and with interpretations of violence and with how those interpretations loop back around and become matters of life and death, right? So I think what is at stake here ultimately is life and death, right? When we think about the theodicies with which we respond to different forms of violence, we're thinking about who lives and who dies and how and why. And so I'll give a couple of more concrete, less abstract examples from my own work. So I started out thinking about theodicy in the context of the events of September 11th, 2001. And when you think about that moment, especially where, the second plane strikes, that's the moment where you hear actually Tom Brokaw on NBC before George W. Bush ever says anything, about these events being an act of war. You hear Tom Brokaw with this, authoritative voice, having just written the book, The Greatest Generation, saying this was an act of war, right? And there you have this defining moment in history of our theodicies of September 11th, 2001, where instead of responding to a heinous crime that needs to be dealt with through international law, we're responding to an act of war with all that entails. And people are still living and dying as a result of that framing, that theodicy. The consequences continue to ramify. I think, the other example that I want to talk about is closer to Biko's work and work that I've been drawn to as I have heard and been increasingly attuned to the way that institutions of memory focused on Black experiences in the United States are utilizing the language of terrorism to call attention to racial violence. And that isn't new. Ida B. Wells did it. She used the language of terror, right? So I don't want to say that this is something new. I do think it's being received by some communities in new ways. I think it's being amplified by some media outlets in new ways, but it's not a new phenomenon, right? But the sociologist Lisa Stampnitzky argues that to call something terroristic, to call violence terroristic, is to label it as violence out of place, right? And I think that is the claim that's being made, right? So for instance, the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial and Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, where a central focus is racial terror lynching and its precursors in the system of enslavement and its legacies in contemporary mass incarceration and police brutality. The claim that's being made is this violence that has been treated as violence that is ordinary, that is to be expected, needs to be understood and interpreted as violence out of place. So we need a new theodicy, right, for interpreting this longstanding and continuous history of violence. So what's at stake? Again, life and death. When violence is defined as illegitimate, we respond very differently than when violence is perceived, especially by those in power, especially by the state, as legitimate. I want to say one more thing that I think is at stake, and that is, the question of how we live with suffering. And I think one of the tricky things about being a social scientist for me is figuring out how to draw that line between the suffering that I've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, suffering that we can and should and must act to ameliorate, and suffering that comes from our human condition, which is ultimately mortal, right? And one of loss, right? And figuring out how to channel social science toward that work of amelioration and mitigation, and how to also find spaces within social science to acknowledge what Jeff Olick, who I think is still on the call, and I have called in other contexts, playing on a line from Paul Ricoeur, a kind of remainder, right? That there is grief there is loss, there is suffering, that is part of our human condition and that we can't escape. And that if we have a social science, if we construct a social science that can't also create spaces for that suffering, then it's not really a fully social science. We're missing some part of human experience. And that is a really tricky thing to write and talk about when there's so much suffering that we can, could, should act to ameliorate and don't. But I also think that remainder needs to be part of the conversation. I'll stop there.
That's a good segue into the next question, which is that one can say that the profession of academia is itself engaged in the process of trying to explain or understand inequality, violence, and suffering. So what is the role of academics, both as knowledge producers and educators, in making sense of this violence? And Biko, we'll start with you, turn to Christina, and end with Zaina.
Yeah, this is a difficult question given the particular state, at least in the United States, of the academy, the attacks on critical race theory, or what is assumed to be critical race theory, the idea that something called wokeness, which quite frankly, if I can be honest with you all, and I know that I'm being recorded, is a euphemism for a racial slur. We'll just be clear about that. I think it becomes, I think the role of a particular kind of the academic in a space like this, when we're trying to understand or explain suffering, inequality, and violence, I think Christina sort of hit the nail on the head, to be honest with you, that part of the work that we have to do, and for me, the ethical dimension of this is, how does one describe the conditions of violence, in my case, anti-Black violence? How does one describe those conditions without leaning into the ethical or the unethical waters of trauma porn or excessive descriptions that are solely just a recapitulation of the violence and the conditions of violence itself? What I think, and I'll be brief about this, what I think is necessary for academics to do, both in their research and then also in their classrooms, is adopt what Christina Sharp calls a modality of care. Right? She calls it care. I can't not think with her or with her work for whatever reason. And one of the things that she says is that if we grant that the world is anti-Black, how do you live and move and be from there? So let's not try to combat or rethink or disentangle or dissimulate anti-Blackness. Let us grant that that's the ground we walk on. And then how does one engage? And from that idea, which I think she thinks about this question of care, is what she calls a problem for thought. That is or what I call sitting with and attending to the lives of those who have been lost, and also the lives of those who are suffering. That happens pedagogically in the classroom by attending to, quite frankly, and I make no apologies for this, an asymmetrical pedagogical approach. I have a few white students in my classes, love them dearly. But if my Black students are struggling, if my students of color are struggling, if my queer students are struggling, I'm constantly attentive to them. Right? I'm attentive to them. And I'm also attentive to my white students insofar as I can dislodge some of the sort of long held presumptions about that. And so all of this leads me to my sort of brief final conclusion that Howard Thurman says it best, that this is a question of finitude. If finitude introduces the question of suffering, then the question for us is, how do we live? And my response to that, ultimately, in terms of theodicy, is that in suffering and inequality and violence, my response is, you do not simply describe the conditions. Description is not liberation, as Catherine McKittrick says. You also, in a very real way, care and understand the care-filled dimensions of your work. Our subjects are not simply abstract objects that we work through, they are lives. And it is important for us to keep that in mind at every moment. That doesn't change the world, but it does open the possibility of a different mode of relating.
I want to echo the emphasis on a modality of care, especially when it comes to our classrooms. I had heard that somebody had invited a whole undergraduate class to this event. I don't know if that's actually true, but if you're an undergraduate and you're here, thank you so much for being here and hanging in with us. And I think, I will just sort of extend. I think my last answer anticipated a lot of what I wanted to say. Or would have wanted to say in response to this question. And in in thinking about trying to, explain inequality, violence, and suffering, I want to think really deeply and think with people whose positionalities lead to very different sets of life experiences than my own, and whose life experiences might challenge in fundamental ways some of my own knowledge claims. I want to think really deeply about what kinds of inequality, suffering, and violence we can explain and ameliorate, and what kinds of suffering we have to hold as a remainder, right? And I want to open spaces where it is safe to talk about that line, where it can feel safe to talk about that line, and where those of us who hold a disproportionate amount of power and privilege in racial, gender, socioeconomic, other hierarchies that Biko highlighted, can be checked and challenged on our assumptions about where that line is. And so I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Christina and Biko, super interesting. I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I second the idea that a politics of care, whether in the classroom or within our own research, is paramount. And I also wonder if working to ameliorate the suffering that exists beyond kind of what Christina called the, what did you call it, the residue suffering, or like the basic suffering that is inescapable. I wonder if working to, the kind of activism and struggle towards ameliorating that kind of suffering also addresses our lack of control when it comes to the inevitable suffering. But I think when it comes to the role of educators and researchers, it's important to remember that those vary significantly from context to context, because the risks and constraints vary. And so a universalistic kind of normative discourse on the role of academics can sometimes be misleading, unfair, or even dangerous in some cases. In the contexts where scholars are working within severely punitive dictatorships, for example, expectations about the responsibility of the intellectual creates painful tensions between the idea of the intellectual as someone responsible for speaking truth to power and whatnot, on the one hand, and the incredibly high cost of exercising such a role. And here, I would like to recognize the incredibly brave and creative ways in which scholars and intellectuals across the global south and elsewhere have undertaken and continue to undertake incredibly dangerous work to challenge injustice, resist oppressive power through literary techniques and devices, through anonymity sometimes, dedicating an entire life and career to unrecognized and unrewarded work under pseudonyms, for example, and through brave confrontations, which have all too often been paid for with their freedoms, their homes, their safety. But in the contexts where academic freedom is relatively protected, and I'm not discounting the very different challenges presented even in, liberal democracies by kind of the state of the academy, as people put it, or maybe I would go as far as calling it kind of the neoliberalized academy. I think even in those contexts, scholars can and should and often do play an important role, not only in bringing attention and to documenting suffering in the research, but also increasingly making sense of that suffering with an awareness of the importance of distinguishing between explaining and explaining away, particularly when dealing with why questions. So understanding why suffering and injustice exists does not mean obviously accepting it as part of a reality or distancing ourselves psychologically from it. Although there is a need sometimes to protect ourselves and our sanity, but I think it's very tricky, but it's very important to master that skill. The social sciences in advanced universities are also called upon to pay more attention to kind of the existential meaning of suffering as a lived experience, to think with suffering, as Arthur Kleinman puts it, as a primary focus, even not responsibility, and arguably it is the replacement of such close, deep encounters with suffering by our kind of mechanicalized and scholastic explanations of suffering that has created this terrible division between our knowledge of suffering and our ability to act towards relieving it. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Zaina. Before we turn to the last round, I just wanted to remind the audience to put their questions either in the Q&A function or in the chat. So our last round is departing from this conversation. What direction would you like to see studies on theodicy and meaning take in the future? We'll start with Christina, Zaina, and then end with Biko.
I want to be super brief because I am aware that we are running out of time, and I would actually love to hear from folks in the audience, maybe folks who haven't written on theodicy, where they would like to see these studies go in the future. So I'm just gonna punt and see what our audience wants to say.
I'll also try to keep it brief, but I still think we have a long way to go in terms of overcoming our internalized biases in the sociological study of meaning. In academia, such biases often manifest themselves in selective solidarities, which I think sometimes still, a century later or so later, echo Du Bois's notion of the global color line, not just the global, even, all kinds of color lines. But when it comes to my own work on Syria and the global, and more generally, it really presents itself as color line in the most vulgar way possible. This idea that there's an invisible geographical line that separates those whose lives, labors, and deaths hold meaning, and those whose lives, labors, and deaths are treated as meaningless. And this is not just a geographical line in a physical sense. I mean, sometimes it is when you're thinking about global inequality, but it often is, obviously related to more subtle dynamics, class, race, and other dividers within a community. An important step towards erasing that line in academic scholarship, I think, involves unsettling these hegemonic theories within cultural sociology by engaging with thought, analysis, and theory from the global south. That is, by treating thinkers and scholars from the periphery not merely as objects of knowledge or resources of empirical applications of those hegemonic theories, but to take seriously their theoretical contributions, valuable knowledge, and bearers of knowledge traditions that are significant and vital for meaningful academic conversation about the state of our world today. And by this, I don't mean engaging kind of diasporic thinkers who are already part of the English-speaking kind of academic sphere, but I mean doing the hard work of seeking out perspectives that emerge from the heart of global suffering. Translation is an important first step towards this kind of expansion of the sociological discourse that is needed, and I think the selection of texts needs to rid itself of kind of the remnants of this Orientalist tradition, which seems to set aside thought that is not perceived as radically different, traditional, or religious, but also to include texts that reside beyond the binaries of so-called Western and Oriental thought traditions, or request to be understood outside of such binaries. And I think only when we engage, we expand our dialogue in this way, can we really understand, claim to have a dignified, conversation about suffering and its implications on our world today.
Thank you. I was scrambling. I left my copy of Toni Morrison's Sula at my apartment, and so I was going to read from her as a way of thinking about where questions or studies of theodicy will move forward. It's going to suck, but I'm going to paraphrase her. There's a community that has been structured by anti-Black violence in the story. And she says that the narrator says that this particular community understood that God had 4 faces, not 3, that the Trinity had another face, one who was inevitably evil, and that the goal for this particular community, when it comes to Black folks and white folks and anti-Blackness and white supremacy and discrimination, she said, this particular narrator in Sula says that this community understood that the goal was not to try and exercise that evil, to fight against it, but instead to figure out how to deal with it, how to live with it, so that it ultimately would eventually change and morph. And so I bring that up to say that perhaps the problem with theodicy, and I would love to hear more from the audience too. So I'll finish here. Maybe the question for us is, how do we move away from Theodician reasoning and instead begin to think about what it means to dwell with those who have been deemed evil? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Biko and Zaina and Christina. And Christina, you pointed out that what is at stake is life and death. So I'm especially thankful for your insights on what is like a very existential or a very central question to our life. So we'll turn to the Q&A. We have a question from Fatma Gocek, and she writes, what would you think about my argument that Western European modernity privileges thought and weaponizes meaning?
I'll start with a quick one. I mean, I certainly agree. It is true, but I think the question is, what are we weaponizing it for? What are we weaponizing meaning for? Which battle and on what side are we fighting? Because, as human beings function through language, and language wants to do things in the world, and we're all trying to do that. So I think, the word weaponizing is, well, I don't like weapons. Most of us here don't, but I don't think it's necessary. Weaponizing meaning is not necessarily in itself a bad thing. I think it is even beyond, Western Enlightenment or modernity. There is this human need to create meaning around suffering, and that creation of meaning seeks some form of justice. If you don't want to call it justice, some form of, following Nussbaum's idea of social pity, we could call it political pity, or compassion. And I think that's okay. I think that's just part of how we work as a species, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It certainly became more central with modernity and kind of, the age of reason, etc. But I think, all of art and philosophy and human thought throughout history has been trying to weaponize meaning to seek some kind of sense of justice or compassion or other ways through which we think we improve our chances of survival individually and collectively. So that's it.
I'll take a stab at it. I think, what I will say, Fatma, is I think about this as someone trained in the tradition of Western philosophy of religion. And what I will say about weaponizing meaning is actually kind of basic, which is that the West understanding of meaning, particularly when it comes to theodicy, is always structured along a Christian sort of secularized theology of atonement. And so part of, and if not a theology of atonement, right, or theology of sacrifice, there is always a sort of, whether it's Hegel's dialectical thinking that sort of produces this idea that progress will overcome the bad things that go down, right, or Marx's idea, which, look, everybody, Marx, I love him, he's a good guy, all of that is great, but the sort of idea, right, that progress is inevitable speaks to a Christian eschatological logic that salvation will come. And if it come, and the only way that it will come is on the basis of people suffering and dying. And so part of the struggle that I have with Western thought, weaponizing meaning, is that none of these nation states are actually God. And as I say oftentimes, as one of the things I say oftentimes is, nation states produce a theology of atonement, which is to say they produce the idea that sacrifices must be made in order for justice to occur. But the difference is, at least in the United States, for example, is in the Christian narrative, Jesus gets up on the third day, Easter Sunday comes. That does not happen for Black people. Black people do not wake up, do not go down on Friday, and then on Sunday they're back. It never happens. And yet it doesn't need to happen because the West already got its justice out of the death. So that's the thing where that weaponizing meaning that I think about when I hear your question. As a philosopher of religion, I keep thinking, yes, indigenous genocide. What do those deaths clear the space for? A city on a hill. Anti-Black chattel slavery. What does that violence clear the space for? A capitalist country that is now the biggest and most best and exceptional country on the planet. That only happens because the atonement has taken, but there is no resurrection on the other side. And the lie is that people like, anyways, all of this to say that's what I hear. And I want to take a sledgehammer, not to the theological narrative, but to the logic, the philosophical logic that requires suffering in order for something like progress to appear.
I just want to briefly add two things. One, I think Biko really touches on some of the factors that have made me ambivalent about using the word or continuing to use the word theodicy in my own work, because it does come at a cost, right? I think early in my own publishing career, it felt like this really important way of staking a claim around the existential dimensions of cultural sociology. And now it's starting to feel like it's calling up all of this resonance with a Christian tradition and the eschatologies and teleologies, right, bound up with that tradition that I don't mean to invoke when I talk about meaning. And so, thank you for the way that you articulate that. I think this is the closest I've come to being in a church for a very long time. And yes, I know this is being recorded. I'm okay with that. I guess just in response to the original question, Muj, I want to say I think one of the really challenging things for me about studying meaning, and I think, this comes back to certain Weberian roots with which I still identify, is that it is, I think, both always a weapon and a bomb, right? In every instance, right? It's functioning in both of these ways, right? And so, yes, it's being instrumentalized. Yes, we need to think about, to try and anticipate some of the next question, right? The sources from which meaning is emanated and the sort of power plays that are taking shape and whose meanings are accepted and whose meanings resonate in public spaces generally. But meaning is also a really important component of what makes us human and what makes us social animals. And I think, the core challenge for me of cultural and I want to say really interpretive sociology is dealing with that constant tension. And meaning that meaning is both and. So I'll leave it at that.
So the last question for today is by Joachim Savelsberg, and he asks, how does the position of knowledge, memory, meaning entrepreneurs play into your thoughts? Individual actors always attribute meaning to events and suffering, but whose meaning resonates in the public sphere? Whose meaning gains recognition? Church, philosophers, journalists, movement activists, politicians.
I think the question for me or response to that is less positional one, right? Whether one is in the church or a philosopher or a journalist or an activist, than it is. And again, I should have said this too. My context of study or my geographical area of expertise is in the United States. And so one of the things that I will say is it is not simply who you are, but what narrative do you espouse? And quite more often than not, that is what opens up the possibility of certain kinds of theodicies rising to the top, right? So the United States, according to a prominent Black scholar, Black religion, his name is Charles Long, he makes a claim that the originating myth in the United States is actually the myth of exceptional and perpetual and, quite frankly, undeniable progress. Right, this is one of the things that the United States may make mistakes, but we are always part of what Cornel West calls a fragile democratic experiment. Right, that this is what is often articulated. I think those who espouse that idea of this particular nation state will always rise to the top. Hence, controversially someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones with the 1619 Project, but also conservatives as well, who are espousing this idea of the United States as a sort of place of freedom, and we need to get over slavery and move away from critical race theory. So I think the question for me is, who is interpolated by the state to do the state's mythological work? Those are the people who rise to the top. It is not the critics, the sort of prophets in the desert proclaiming doom and gloom, those of us who sit on the outskirts and the margins, even within the academy. It is those who espouse the national mythos of perpetual progress. And this is why Martin Luther King Jr. has become a simulacrum of himself in the wake of his death. All we remember is the dream and not the communist criticisms. And that is important, and that is necessary, because that king is the king that everyone can identify with. That's the king that says the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, without the capitalist criticism, without the criticism of militarism, without the criticism of the Vietnam War. All of that goes away, because the king we need is the king that produces the mythology of the United States is perpetually getting better. So I think that's how I would answer that question, that who shows up are the people who can keep this national myth. And in this case, that means a national lie of perpetual progress going.
And I think equally at a more global scale, I think that's exactly what often happens. I think it's also a very, very complex question. And I do agree that there are, if you want to call it an industry, or the memory industry, or the meaning-making industry, does have its kind of, gangster. So losers and winners, let's put it more diplomatic. But at the same time, I think, that's precisely basically what the paper I published on the right to meaning talks about, is that the paradox that Jeffrey Alexander talks about like whose narrative wins, whose memory industry, or who in the memory industry or in the meaning making industry gets heard, or whose narrative becomes dominant and agreed and hegemonic. It is really those who can disseminate successfully, widely, broadly, through access to power, a narrative of victim, perpetrator, wrongdoing that is acceptable, sellable in a world that is dominated by a certain power, and whose narratives infiltrate every cultural, all cultural meaning, particularly, like the dominant narratives of, who's evil, who's good, and who we trust. Narrative do we give a platform to, and who don't, how and on what conditions. And I think this is the result of global power structures, a lack of political will to respond supportively to injustice narratives of groups that have been subjected to kind of horrendous events, to traumatic events. So it's not, I don't think it's the outcome of, as Alexander suggests, social, structural, or cultural reasons, because everybody's trying to be heard. But I think the carrier groups that are failing to deliver their narratives, who want to participate in the meaning industry but don't really get a very good hearing, are those whose position in the world today is one without access to power, that is far away from power. So it's a bit of a simplistic answer, but that's what I have right now.
Thank you, Zaina. So we've reached the end of our session. Thank you again to the panelists for your insights on such a difficult topic. And thanks for the audience for coming and engaging with us. So stay tuned for the next installment of the Culture and Contemporary Life series, which will be on the body and culture. Thank you again, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Marae, Biko, Zaina, Christina, for giving us such a thoughtful and stimulating conversation today. Thank you all for being here. See you next time.
Thank you so much, everyone.